It is my great honor to welcome Professor Andrea Wright today. Professor Wright is coming to us from the College of William and Mary, where she is an associate professor of anthropology in Asian and Middle Eastern studies. Her work examines the histories of capitalism and its contemporary expressions in South Asia, the Arabian Peninsula, and more recently, the United States. As a historical anthropologist, Professor Wright's research draws upon colonial theories of mobility and decolonial theories of community to better understand how labor and energy production shape economies, geopolitical dynamics, and social inequalities, of which she'll unravel for us more today. Her first book, Between Dreams and Ghosts, Indian Migration and Middle Eastern Oil, is an ethnography of Indian migration to oil and gas projects in the Persian Gulf. Her second book, Unruly Labor, A History of Oil in the Arabian Sea, which comes out next month from Stanford University Press, explores strikes at oil projects in Iran and the Arabian Peninsula from the 1930s to the 1970s. Please join me in welcoming Professor Wright.
Hello, thank you all for being here. Thank you, Nagar, for such a generous introduction. And thank you, Allison, for doing all the organizing for this. I'm really excited to share my work with you today. And most of it's gonna draw from what I worked on in Unruly Labor because it's coming out next month. And I have, if you're interested, I have a flyer that has a discount code that I printed out, so you're welcome to grab one if you want. So in Unruly Labor, I'm investigating the historical processes that led to the contemporary depoliticization of labor and today's racialized labor hierarchies that are prevalent in the Gulf. And today, what I want to look at is the role of oil companies in depoliticizing labor. And I want to think about how investigating this will help us understand the relationships between governments and corporations. And it's also hopefully going to make a case for the importance of centering both local and mobile workers in our histories of the Gulf. What we'll see is that attempts to control workers, we'll see attempts by corporations to control workers, and that despite these attempts, workers continue to agitate for better working and living conditions. What will emerge is that citizenship is crucial for understanding the form and the efficacy of worker movements. And this is in some ways pushing a little bit against Timothy Mitchell's argument that he makes in Carbon Democracy, where he argues that the material qualities of oil impact or lead to it not being as not as a great place for workers to advocate for democratic change as coal was because of how oil is produced. It's above ground, so it can be surveyed by managers, and because of the ways in which oil is distributed, doesn't allow for disruption as coal does. And instead, I'm pushing for the idea that we also have to understand citizenship. Today, we're gonna look at some key factors that will include shifting solidarities, how nationality has been racialized, and how this is used to construct difference that's played out in things like segregation and also plays out in areas like nationalism and pan-Arab movements. We'll also look at oil company practices like increased contracting and increasingly hiring temporary labor, restrictive labor laws, and we'll end with the securitization of oil and its contemporary impacts. So, to begin, it wasn't uncommon historically for Indians, Pakistanis, Iranian and Arab workers to all join together and strike. For example, in 1938 in Bahrain, all the workers of all nationalities went on strike. Oil had been discovered in Bahrain in 1931, and oil production began in 1932. And in 1936, an oil refinery near Awali was built. This is all being done by Babco, which is a subsidiary of the US-based Standard Oil Company of California. In the late 1930s, the world was in the midst of a severe economic downturn, and in Bahrain, prices were rising rapidly throughout the country. Only a small percentage of the population could find employment at Babco. And for those who did work at Babco, which is the Bahrain Petroleum Company, they lived in bare barracks made of wood. In this context, in 1938, the workers in Bahrain went on their first organized strikes at the oil fields. These strikes involved a coalition of workers that included Bahrainis, other Arab workers, and Indians. And here, Indian means people from India and Pakistan, because it's before India's independence. The 352 British Indians at Babco comprised 13% of Babco's workforce, and they outnumbered all Americans, Canadians, and the British workers there combined. These Indians in Bahrain were just a few of the increasing numbers of Indians working in Iran and the Arabian Peninsula. And by 1950, approximately 15,000 Indians worked in oil and oil-related industries in the Arabian Peninsula. During this time, Indians worked and went on strike alongside local workers, as well as workers from, and they were doing this with workers from other places in the Middle East, as well as other places globally. Both in the pre-World War II and post-war periods, worker strikes at oil projects were common. Often these strikes were made of coalitions of workers and brought together workers of differing religions and ethnicities. So in the 1938 strike in Bahrain was, according to British sources, inspired by ideas of Arab nationalism. And this strike was successful not only because it brought together Sunni and Shia Bahrainis, but it also involved Indians. And working together, the strikers argued for better pay for Bahrainis and for Indians. After the strike, some of the workers' demands were met, but not equal pay. There was another strike in 1943 that did more to further worker demands. Labor organizers, again, in this strike focused on common working and living conditions as a way to bring workers together. The proximity of working together and sharing the same bad living conditions impacted worker actions and helped influence how workers formed solidarities. So living and working together also helped workers form solidarities in Iran during the 1946 strikes. In July of 1946, workers at the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, AIOC, who were working up near the refinery at Abidan, went on strike. And this was, at the time, the largest strike that had ever happened in Iran, and one of the largest strikes that had ever happened in the Middle East. It was organized by the Tudeh Party. Now, during this strike, Indians, and particularly Indians who were not managers, so Indians who worked as tradesmen or as laborers, joined in the strike. And we can see from their writings that it was not only the ideology of the Tudeh Party that influenced them joining, but rather they were also motivated by the shared abysmal living conditions that they experienced at Abidan. So the housing conditions for non-British employees were so poor that there was, in general, large negative responses. So one manager at AIOC wrote, quote, "The vast majority of our labor forces are still living in scandalous accommodations and urine-tainted squalor in little homes. These homes," the supervisor explained, were, quote, "without sanitation, water supply, or lighting, and with either too much ventilation or no ventilation at all," unquote. Housing for laborers was so poorly made, was very poorly made, and there was not enough accommodations for all workers. Another manager wrote, quote, "Overcrowding is rampant, and up to 10 persons sleep on the damp floor of a 10-foot room, huddled together to keep warm in the winter or to keep out of the sun in the summer afternoons," unquote. British government officials largely agreed, and they characterized the living conditions of laborers as, quote, "a penal settlement in the desert, with accommodations little better than pigsties," unquote. Living accommodations were so poor that AIOC managers warned not to replicate these conditions at other places. Okay. And by sharing these living conditions and these poor working conditions, this helped inform this larger general strike. So despite these large coalitions of strikes that we see by workers in the 1930s and the 1940s, from the 1940s to the 1960s, worker strikes became increasingly fragmented, and workers faced growing restrictions on their right to strike. Now, some of the ways that oil company practices impacted shifting solidarities included management practices that were based on a racialization of nationality and accompanying racist policies along with that. These logics were expressed through things like segregated living spaces, work segregation by nationality, and disparate pay based on nationality. So this is housing in Bahrain for American and British workers. So we can see it's partly indifferent from the Abidan housing. But in the late 1940s and early 1950s, two American companies, oil companies, Babco and the Arabian American Oil Company, or Aramco, which operated in Saudi Arabia, drew the most complaints from Indian and Pakistani workers for racism. Now, the fact that workers saw both Aramco and Babco as companies with similarly racist attitudes and practices maybe is not surprising, given the close connections in ownership and management between the two companies. So at this time, Babco was owned by Texaco and SoCal. And Texaco and SoCal also each had a 30% stake in Aramco. In addition, upper-level managers and technical personnel at both Babco and Aramco were primarily Americans, and American managers regularly circulated between the Aramco projects and the Babco projects, and both companies frequently worked with the same contractors. Now, as Robert Vitalis describes in his work, American managers at Aramco imported racist Jim Crow policies to both manage and train workers in Saudi Arabia. The use of racism and segregation as a management technique was not unique to the oil industry in the Middle East, and racial labor hierarchies were also mobilized in, for example, the oil industry in Mexico and in factories in India. In the late 1940s, and both Babco and Aramco were operating with high numbers of employees, and nationality informed the types of jobs for which one was employed. In 1949, the labor force at Babco was approximately 7,000 workers. This labor force was composed of 93 Americans, roughly 800 British and European employees, 1,500 workers from India and Pakistan, and nearly 4,500 Bahraini and other Khaliji or Gulf Arab workers. The majority of clerical, artisanal, and non-European supervisory jobs were held by Indians. In addition, there was approximately 300 Indian and Pakistanis who were engaged in semi-skilled jobs, which were principally domestic duties. At Aramco, Aramco had a larger workforce. There was 12,000 Saudi workers, about 1,000 Indian and Pakistani workers, and 400 Sudanese workers. In addition, at Aramco, there were 1,200 Italians and approximately 2,600 Americans. Similarly to the job hierarchies prevalent at Babco, local workers at Aramco were primarily employed as laborers. Indians and Pakistanis worked as tradesmen, and local workers were hired as manual laborers. And here we see a system that was being established in which employees' jobs were hierarchically ordered by their nationality. Job hierarchies meant that even when workers from the Middle East or South Asia were hired for highly skilled positions, they were not given positions of authority. Only Europeans and Americans had positions of authority. Indians who worked in skilled positions at oil companies argued that this system was because of racism, and specifically, they asserted that the managers were in charge not because of their skill set, but because they were white. These strict labor hierarchies at Babco, Indians reported, differed from other projects that they had worked at in the Gulf. And in particular, skilled Indian workers contrasted their experiences at Aramco and Babco directly with their experiences while working at the British-run Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, where they argued that racism was less prevalent. At Babco and Aramco, job hierarchies were increasingly based on nationality. Living conditions were also impacted, and workers were segregated by their nationality. Housing conditions were substandard for employees that were not from the United States and Europe, and workers were housed based on their nationality. Workers also spent their leisure time separately, and there were few opportunities for interaction among workers of different nationalities. As one observer noted, quote, "There's no mixing amongst employees in social events nor sports events, with the exception of an occasional cricket or soccer match," unquote. Such restrictions, in conjunction with hiring workers of specific nationalities for specific jobs, helped to prevent workers from forming intergroup alliances and solidarities. Okay, so we can see this is an aerial view of Awali and the spatial segregation there. Worker segregation was kept strictly on the job and off the job. and recreational facilities were poor for most workers. One Aramco manager visited Babco and described the situation as, quote, no recreational facilities provided for other than American and European employees with the exception of a few playing fields, unquote. In contrast, British and American employees had access to a club, which was for a nominal fee and then became free in 1953. And the club had amazing things. It had a squash court, tennis courts, cricket fields, football fields, hockey pitches, swimming pools, a golf course, a baseball diamond, a barbecue pit, a cinema, a library, and the list goes on. Access to these facilities, of course, depended on one's nationality and race. Now, this segregation caused friction because workers were unhappy that they didn't have access to these things. But they also disrupted the forming of intergroup solidarities. And these practices were becoming increasingly common. So in Iden in 1950, British Petroleum was building a new refinery that required thousands of workers. There, they decided to house workers in different camps based on their nationality. And different nationalities were given different perks or benefits based on their nationality. So for example, Indians were given a larger allocation of alcohol, but they weren't given as much time or access to the cricket field as some other groups. And this caused tensions and fighting amongst groups as they wanted to know why they didn't have access to the same things other workers had. So in this getting different things, there's tensions between workers. Now, racialization and racism impacted solidarities, but so too did decolonization and ideologies of citizenship and rights. So, for example, in 1947, we have the independence of India and Pakistan from Great Britain, and this impacted worker organizing as well. So, immediately, we begin to see workers forming strikes along nationality lines. And by 1953, we have the first strike that's all Indians. And this includes Indians who are both laborers all the way up through managers. So every Indian at a job site in Aden ended up joining in this strike together. But they didn't form coalitions with any other groups or nationalities there. During these strikes, Indians appeal not to the oil company or to the local government, but rather to the Indian government to protect their rights. And what's important here is that they're arguing that it's the duty of a free and independent state to protect the rights of citizens. Because they're working outside of their home country, we see that depoliticization of the oil fields doesn't mean necessarily that there's no political action around oil, but rather that the political action around oil is displaced, and here it's directed towards the Indian government. In addition to things like India's and Pakistan's independence, we also see growing nationalism amongst Gulf Arabs and growing commitment to pan-Arab movements in the 1950s. Like Indian workers, local workers too asked their governments to protect their rights. And we see that local workers, that these requests by local workers actually had an impact on government policies and on oil production. One site where local governments were particularly receptive to the demands by local workers was in advocating for local workers around contract or temporary labor. Local governments would petition or outright forbid oil companies from hiring large amounts of local workers as contract or temporary laborers. Now, largely this is because contract or temporary workers were paid very poorly. They were treated very poorly. They didn't have any job stability, so they'd be hired for a day and then let go. And in particular, local governments asked that local Gulf Arabs not be hired for these positions, but they encouraged oil companies to hire Indians and Pakistanis for these positions. In addition to not wanting to hire contract or temporary workers, they also the local governments asked the oil companies to directly hire workers instead of having them employed by contractors, which are because they felt that contractors didn't treat workers as well, and because contractors didn't train workers. In contrast, Indian and Pakistani laborers continued to be hired on a daily contract basis and by contractors, and this did not provide them with the same job stability and income or job security that monthly wage employment would give them. This contributed to a precarious employment status, and some Indian and Pakistani workers expressed a disinclination to participate in large-scale strikes or work stoppages because they were worried about losing their jobs. Now, oil companies had other ways besides contract labor or not having a large workforce to try to hamper labor organizing. And this included practices where they tried to hire workers who they tried to not hire workers who had a history of participating in strikes. So, for example, BAPCO implemented a new policy for all recruiters of Indian and Pakistani workers. And this policy required that recruiters get a signed certificate from the police saying that workers had not participated in strikes before at places in India, nor were they parts of unions in India. So they were not hiring people who had a history of labor organizing. In addition, oil companies increasingly had a preference for hiring stateless workers. And this was especially seen regarding Palestinian workers and workers from Italians from Eritrea. So in Saudi Arabia, Aramco managers believed Palestinians were great employees because they didn't have a state to protect their rights. When discussing Palestinians who worked at Aramco's refinery in Saudi Arabia, but who had previously worked at the Haifa refinery in Israel, American managers reflected on how Palestinian statelessness ended up impacting their organizing, and this is 1952. So Palestinians carry out plant operation work and craft work, as well as clerical, and they give some trouble regarding wages and conditions. So far, they are not organized into labor unions, and some of them now hold senior operating posts, a fear that was expressed that if they organized, they could cause serious dislocation of operations. In the meantime, they seem too scared to take too drastic action in their protests, as most of them are displaced persons from Israel, and they have not forgotten where they come from and what may await them on their return. Now here, Palestinians' status as refugees meant they were less likely to form unions or have these large-scale work stoppages. These preferences continue and also become intensified when in the mid-1960s, we see moves for greater surveillance of migrant workers, and there's introduction of permits throughout the Gulf. In addition, we increasingly see that when foreign workers do strike, they're just immediately deported. So and they're replaced by access workers. So control over the workforce becomes increasingly important as oil companies worry about the nationalization of oil and oil infrastructure. Particularly after Iran nationalized oil in 1951, we see that the British government and oil companies begin to become very worried. This is particularly concerning in the Arabian Peninsula because most of the world's oil was thought to be located there at the time, and the British government felt its options were limited if oil was nationalized. Now, this is different than what happened in 1951 in Iran, when AIOC helped organize an almost worldwide embargo of Iranian oil. But by 1955, so just a few years later, the UK British government officials believed that the need for oil, particularly for industry, is so large that they would not be able to actually successfully have an embargo of oil from the Middle East. And this issue is not only for states that produce oil, so like Saudi Arabia, but also in places like Bahrain, where by the 1950s, oil supply is, they're not producing a lot of oil in Bahrain, there's not a lot of oil reserves, but the refinery in Bahrain is one of the main sites of where oil from Saudi Arabia is refined. So that infrastructure also is seen as being necessary for the security of the UK economy. Now, this means that strikes in Bahrain and throughout the Arabian Peninsula were of concern. And this influences how labor laws are written. And I'm going to look now at an example specifically in the 1950s in Bahrain. So in 1954, local workers at the BAPCO refinery went on strike demanding their rights. According to BAPCO managers, the strike was influenced by people from outside Bahrain and directed towards the government, not the company. As one BAPCO manager, Josephson, recalled, they got to the students. Oh, here, I'm not there yet. They got to the students, the younger group of people. Yes, there was a lot of unrest among the young people. And then I'm skipping some. A lot of them were our trainees, our young student trainees that we had sent off to England for training and then coming back to Bahrain. And all they would say is, we want our rights. That's all I ever got out of them. Now, Josephson describes the strike as a violent outburst. He also reported that workers were organized in demanding rights, but he characterizes these demands as largely nonsensical. So this is a larger excerpt from this interview. This group was so militant in the refinery, and they came marching up and tried to come through the hall in a group. I just went out and confronted them. I said, what's your beef? Why? Well, we want our rights. Well, what rights do you want? They wouldn't tell me. They just wanted our rights. In my view, they had no reason to complain about their rights. They were getting a free education. I told these boys, we're paying for your education. The government gives you free hospital, free schools. You don't have to pay any taxes. What more do you want? You're being treated very well. I couldn't get them to agree, so I alerted our security to bring in the government security people. They were still pretty radical, so the local security came in, plus our security, and just loaded them on buses and sent them home. Now, in this quote, Josephson reports that he told the striking workers to come back when they were, quote, ready to talk sense, unquote. The strike continued for several weeks and ended for an unclear reason. Following the strike, about 50% of the employees returned to BAPCO and were rehired. Now, BAPCO managers' engagement with this strike in 1954 highlights some key aspects concerning oil production, political action, and corporate practices in the Arabian Peninsula in the 1950s. First, BAPCO managers identified the leaders of the strike as young men who the company had sent off to England for additional education. This resonates with description of strike leaders at other oil projects in the 1950s. And for example, in 1953, Aramco managers said that the leaders of a large strike there were workers who the company had sent to the United States and Lebanon for training. Second, managers characterized workers' call for rights as misguided or incomprehensible. As managers described their response, they pointed to benefits such as free education and hospitals. This response depoliticized the claims made by striking workers. Managers interpreted workers' claims to be about personal benefits, and they ignored workers' larger claims for political and workplace changes. Such responses also articulated a paternalism that was often used by managers in regard to calls for self-determination or development. Third, managers' use of local security forces to end the strike after attempts to talk sense failed. And this militarized response highlights the potential strikes posed, the potential dangers strikes posed to the local government, the British administration, and oil companies. This use of the security forces also draws attention to how the local government, the British administration, and oil companies worked together to end strikes. So, this strike, described by Josephson, was just one of multiple strikes that occurred in Bahrain between 1953 and 1956. Many of these strikes are thought to have begun in 1953 following Muharram, and it was subsequently followed by the formation of the High Executive Committee, which was later renamed the National Union Committee. The committee was popular, and this popularity was seen to be a response to dissatisfaction with increasing government control over commerce, increased numbers of migrants, and that Bahrain was experiencing a slower pace of development than in Kuwait, and locals were being promoted at a slower rate than in Saudi Arabia. The success of the movement is seen in its ability to bridge sectarian and class divides in Bahrain. And there was a general trade union connected to this organization, and it attracted thousands of members in just its first few months. But membership in the union was restricted to Arabs. So there's low levels of worker unrest, and this really takes off in late 1956 with the series of strikes. Now, BAPCO managers described this as the first serious friction in Bahrain. And what was particularly influential at the time was Egypt's nationalization of the Suez Canal in July of that year. And people living and working in the Arabian Peninsula, including Indians and Pakistanis, participated in demonstrations in support of Egypt. After Israeli, British, and French forces invaded Egypt in late October and early November of 1956, demonstrations in Bahrain intensified. There were calls to boycott English companies, worker strikes, and sabotage at oil projects. During these strikes, popular sentiment was with Egypt, and this made it hard for the local government to respond effectively. Following large strikes in Bahrain, eventually in November of 1956, British troops entered Manama, and the committee was disbanded and the leaders were jailed. Following these strikes, restrictive labor laws were put into place in Bahrain. A committee to draft labor laws had been created in 1954 following those original strikes, but they were very slow in implementing any changes. But following these strikes in 1956, this became a bigger issue. And one of the things that happens is that the oil company, Caltex, which is the parent company of the Bahrain Petroleum Company at the time, begins to push that a labor law that largely mimics the U.S. Taft-Hartley Act be implemented. Now, the Taft-Hartley Act was extremely restrictive to workers. It both limited people's ability to go on strike, and it increased the liability of unions for damages that were done during strikes. It was extremely unpopular amongst labor unions in the U.S., as these rally signs show, and there's calls on the president to veto it. Now, Truman did veto the law. He called it a, quote, dangerous intrusion on freedom of speech, but this was overridden by Congress in June of 1947. So there's already this restrictive template for strikes. Following the 1956 strikes in Bahrain, writing these new labor laws became important, and they and on the labor law drafting committee is an employee of Babco, as well as a representative from the British. The law ends up drawing upon American anti-union legislation, and the result was that the labor law that was passed in 57-58 skews in favor of employers. It has a management rights section and a right to work clause. Now, the coordination of the British administration, Babco, and the local ruler to curtail the rights of workers and to depoliticize worker action is clear in the restrictions that are put in place around unions and strikes in the law. The policies that make unions liable for damages make strikes less effective. Okay. And we have these are cartoons that were put out by unions also around Taft-Hartley. In addition to imposing restrictions on unions, workers' right to strike was also greatly curtailed in the Bahraini labor laws. As restrictions on strikes were debated, Caltex, which again is the parent company of Babco, actively petitioned the British government that strikes be made illegal in Bahrain, and the company's legal advisors provided useful language for doing so. In May of 1956, Caltex's legal advisors met with the British government officials in London and provided a template drawn from Taft-Hartley. In that meeting, Caltex lawyers asked that, quote, legislation be introduced to make it illegal to call a strike which is not in furtherance of a trade dispute with the particular company or whose premise the strike took place, unquote. Government officials, British government officials, thought this was a great idea because it would both hinder work strikes as well as political strikes. And they thought such legislation would maintain production, reduce the efficacy of strikes, and ensure political stability. British officials also believed that Caltex's own policies would help curtail strikes. So Caltex was a US-based company that the British described as a, quote, rich, tough employer, unquote. Due to Caltex's attitudes towards unions and strikes, they believed that there would not be a lot of strikes or unions happening in Bahrain. And they believed that any unions that were formed in Bahrain would face, quote, perpetual financial difficulties, unquote, because of lawsuits. Now, they're drawing this observation from Caltex's efforts globally to hinder worker strikes. So, for example, in the 1950s and early 1960s, Caltex spent almost a decade suing its workers at a refinery in Kerala in India because they had gone on a strike that the company thought was illegal, and it wanted to fire those workers. Both the local court in India and the Indian, eventually goes to the Indian Supreme Court, did find that the strike was illegal, but said the Caltex couldn't fire the workers. So this lawsuit largely is unsuccessful, but what it does do is it ties the union and the workers into a lawsuit that's very costly for over 10 years, and it seems to damper future strike actions. In the end, the Bahraini labor law had key similarities with the Taft-Hartley Act. It required a complicated 21-day cooling off period, and it required advance notification of strike. Additional similarities included the liability of unions and the restrictions on what industries could go on strike. In the United States, the Taft-Hartley Act was seen to really restrain people's ability to collectively organize and increase employers' rights. And these constraints were echoed in the Bahraini labor ordinance. Given the differing attitudes towards strikes, the similarities between the Bahraini labor ordinance and the Taft-Hartley Act demonstrate the power of oil companies to shape local laws. Even after labor laws were implemented, the Labor Advisory Committee, which again has a BABCO representative as one of the key members, continues to meet. It's now called, and it continues to inform laws. Now, British administrators in the Gulf thought that this model of having a representative from oil companies on labor law boards was fantastic, and they made this a recommendation throughout the Gulf. And they thought that this would allow for, it would help avoid the introduction of legislation that would be undesirable. And officials suggested that other companies also, at other places in the Gulf, companies encouraged the formation of these boards. So, and I'm just gonna, this is like the last part. So as there's these restrictive labor laws end up providing a rationalization or a justification for militarized responses to strikes and then this becomes increasingly common in the 1960s. This is the HMS Striker in 1964, which is in responding to large work stoppages that occur in Abu Dhabi beginning in May of 1964, where workers are actually making claims that we are the government, we own the oil, not you. But these strikes end up being ended when the Trucial Oman Scouts and then the British Army intercede. So we see through this process a point where today worker strikes are almost unheard of in the Gulf. And this is one of the few worker stoppages I have seen. And this is in Dubai in 2015. But one of the things I'd like to point out is that even as laws become restrictive and it became increasingly difficult to organize for better conditions, workers were still mobilizing politically. Today's restrictions were formed by these mid-century practices and oil companies' policies of segregation, which lessened intergroup solidarities, along with changing ideologies of state governments, and which protect individual citizens' rights, meant that calls for changes to working environments were fragmented. Further blows were dealt by restrictive labor laws and the hiring of precarious workers and the eventual militarized response to strikes. But today, like historically, citizenship and the state are a key factor. And even though in the Gulf strikes are very, very uncommon, workers in the Gulf still do mobilize, although in India we see that these mobilizations happen in India, like Indian workers return from the Gulf and then petition the Indian government. So I want to, so it's not, while there's not the large scale collective organizing that happens in the Gulf, we still do see activism, and I'd be happy to talk about this more, but I just wanted to point to this at the end. Okay, thank you.
We don't have a microphone today, so if you're going to ask a question, please project. Sherry.
Thank you so much for a fantastic presentation. I was wondering if you could speak a bit more
This is an excellent question. I'm thinking about it. I think Timothy Mitchell has a big chapter on self-determination and how it was being thought about around oil. I think that in my readings of the archive, or at least in which largely focuses on management, because I've been looking for these like moments of strike. Self-determination doesn't come up as such. However, after India's independence, like at Aramco, they hire fewer and fewer Indians. And in part, this is because of restrictions by the Saudi government about hiring local workers and Gulf workers. But there's also this area where it's seen as too much of a hassle because they can directly petition the Indian government for help. And that's an American oil company, so I'm not sure I'd exactly get your answer. At British oil projects, there is it doesn't seem as though independence makes a huge change, in part because there's an argument that there's a lot of Indians who have experience in the oil industry, and there's high levels of unemployment in India. And so the argument that's made by recruiters and by managers is that workers can be fired with no trouble at all. They can be sent back to India, and that replacement workers can be easily hired. So it's, in many ways, it seems like it's less of a determinant there. The Indian government does sometimes halt emigration out of India, which is seen kind of as a hassle, and I think that's one of the reasons Aramco doesn't hire workers. But a lot of the British companies felt like they had good enough relations with the Indian government, that they could circumvent those restrictions. So, yeah. I think there's a lot there to say, but hopefully that's helpful. Yeah. Oh.
There were some surprises to me, and there were few workers and at the end of your talk, you ended up with the ecosystem, and I was wondering about the people. If you find the transition from oiling and post-slavery to oil industry, meant also that some of the practices and regulations were passed on to these oil companies, let's say from power to companies, oil industry, and also the recruitment of standards of these people and use it labor on labors. And if that can tell us something about how can we bridge these two episodes in Gulf history that you will not connect.
That's a fantastic question. And in some ways, I think a lot of my research has been like pushing against some of the earlier research that has been done on migrant labor that kind of, not contemporary, but a little bit earlier research that says, well, everything is because of these, illiberal traditions in the Gulf and the way that labor is always done. And I think it's really clear that actually oil companies are I think really not, it didn't seem to me that labor laws that were written in the United States would necessarily be moved to the Gulf, and that would be the reason that we have the horrible, like the restrictive labor conditions that we have. But certainly, pre-oil social relations certainly impacted, how the oil industry was being shaped. And it's something that both British administrators and oil company officials, as well as contractors, because some of the contractors are local, are very aware of and do, use when it's to their benefit. So I think that there's some things to be said there. And then I think that there's also some, so I think there's some ways in which it continues, and I think you're right, it does bring up this really interesting connection. And of course, like oil companies don't totally, or imperial governments don't just totally restructure all of social relations. But I think in this case, I think that the way the world, actually globally, workers have fewer rights and that these are not allowed, I think are happening a lot we can see the Gulf as a good microscope for those global processes.
Fantastic presentation. I really like, I think the argument that in fact act influence the way in which British colonial officers shape local labor laws that I've heard about before. I had two questions. One is about the role of the ILO, the International Labour Organization, in drafting these labor laws. And the second one is about, well, just a thought I had, and maybe one comment on it, which is about these sort of different eras of colonialism in the region that maybe sort of that fundamentally differ with each other. One is sort of this colonial continuation of the British Empire in countries like Bahrain, UAE into the 1950s, 60s, early 70s, versus also your talk mentioned Iran, where British influence rose much earlier. Is there something to be said about differences between those two contexts?
Yeah, no, thank you. So for the ILO, the British government is very aware of like restrictions of the ILO, and so when they're trying to reduce like strikes or make it illegal, one draft of the Bahraini labor law made it illegal for workers to unionize. And I think that the British were extraordinarily worried that this would be looked upon disfavorably by the ILO and would lead to all these issues. So there, certainly the International Labor Organization is an organization that's at least being skirted, or at least is being not wanting to like look illiberal, I guess. In the 1960s, like Qatar and Abu Dhabi, what Qatar for sure wants to join the ILO, and the British are really against it, like very much against it. And they actually write to the British government officials, write to the ILO and ask about it. And the ILO actually is really against it too. Like they think it would skew the racial makeup, that's their words, the racial makeup of the organization. And there's this way in which the International Labor Organization is not necessarily sympathetic to or that interested in what's happening in the Arabian Peninsula, at least. Regarding these different eras of colonization, I think, they're totally different stories. And I think that, there's some similarities and some differences. And one of the things I think we see emerging is that there's these imperial powers and corporations that are actually largely shaping the world in new ways as well. In the book, one of the trains of thought that I try to follow is thinking a lot about citizenship and how citizenship's being understood in these different contexts. So, in Iran, there's moves to, I guess, have fewer migrant workers in the oil industry beginning in the mid-30s. And there's understandings about national development that are attached to that the British are, largely sympathetic to. And that oil companies actually believe too, because their human resources trainings also are really big into citizens as being individual directors of a country's modernization or development. And so there's that. And in India, of course, Indians change in 1947, Indians and Pakistanis change from being citizens, like imperial citizens who are part of the British Empire, to being citizens of the nation states. And this impacts both how they're seen by oil companies and the British government, but also how they advocate for improved working conditions. Like, so instead of going to the political resident in Bahrain, they go, to the Indian government. So I think that, yes, there's these different phases of colonization as well as these, or the waning of colonization in some ways, along with these like emergence of new state corporate interactions that I think, that's.
my mind, like right now, the structure that it's quite clear in that region is that there is a hierarchy between, let's say, like Western areas, system of the Gulf, and then other Arab nations, such as Palestinians, and then South Asian. Was that a thing back then, or like did they get more? I don't know. Like, were they treated better?
Right. No, this is, yeah, that's an excellent question. So there's a few things. Like now we have exactly, I think, the labor hierarchies that you talk about. And of course, in the period, like the 50s, 40s, 50s, early 60s, a lot of the laborers are local Gulf workers, which I think is not what many people would expect if they just are looking at contemporary labor relations in the Gulf. Palestinians both were served at all levels of the oil industry. So they were everything from manual laborers to managers or technical experts. Of course, they faced similar restrictions as Indians did, and they weren't able to be like the main manager, but there were some, especially ones who had experience working in other places, who worked, I guess, at the who worked. So there were some who worked as technical experts or tradesmen and things like that. The numbers increase after the partition of Palestine, and there's and there seems to be a large influx. Like Indian workers, they seem to be laborers in particular seem to be easily replaced, easy to fire, easy to control, which I was surprised by too, because I hadn't anticipated finding that in the archives, and it really shows up a lot in the correspondence between oil companies, which is also interesting, because I think maybe in the official numbers they're getting counted as Lebanese or from Jordan, or I don't know how exactly they're being counted, because they show up when people are writing about their workers, but not necessarily in the toll, the numbers. So.
Thank you for a fascinating lecture. I'm curious as to the role of gender in this whole dynamic. I'm wondering, were, for example, laborers allowed to bring their families to work camps? Was this part of the working conditions reserved for managers? And for example, did the fact that it was such a male-dominated workplace impact the types of protests that was utilized? I mean, were there any sabotage or slowdowns, in addition to the strikes?
Yeah, so this is an excellent question. Actually, as I was finishing this history book, I was there's no women in the whole, there's there's, I cite, female scholars, but there's no, it's just, there's no women. Except maybe there's a reference that oil companies would like to be able to hire women from Europe or America, but half the time they're not successful in those requests. So there's no women. Now, local workers often have their families living with them at work sites. And when I mean local, I mean Gulf Arab workers, often have their families. And the Indian government pushed really hard for workers to be able to bring their families, and they brought up the International Labor Organization, and they made all these claims, but they weren't successful in that. And I think in part because the oil companies found it easier to have people who could be fired, and it's easier to deport one person than many, as well as local and British government officials were worried about people making claims on being able to stay in the country. They were very aware that mobile workers had fewer ways of advocating for their rights effectively. There are moments of sabotage, in particular in 1956. So there's people are blowing things up in Kuwait. And the drills are damaged. There's and I think this is interesting. There's also workers also become aware of how vulnerable they are, and how readily the military responds, and so they also have ways of strike. They'll go on hunger strikes, for example, and they'll like then write to newspapers to advertise that they're on strike. So, and that's often something done by Indian or Pakistani workers as a way, and they'll write to Indian and Pakistani newspapers as a way of trying to mobilize their governments, Indian or Pakistani governments, to intercede on their behalf. So there are like a variety of tactics that are used. But yeah, no, it's a interesting, like, because at least in my previous work, which is more ethnographic, has women in it, or not non-men, but yeah, this is largely male.
All right, well, thank you, Professor Wright, for joining us today.
Thank you.